Behind Elven Lines by S.P.Dorning. Gyro Lash had never been accused of being a very cautious gnome. As a matter of fact, it was in his long list of infractions that had earned him his place on the decisive Elven Assessment Detail, or Dead List. The list was almost a running joke in the Dwarven Military, but only if you had a dark, morbid sense of humor. It was the job of the operatives working on the Dead List to recon Elven troop positioning, and to gather any intel that the Dwarven military might find useful in its war with the Elven nation. But the Dead List carried a dual meaning, and if you were caught behind enemy lines, you'd find out the second meaning faster than you wanted to. No one could really remember who started the war. Its beginnings were lost somewhere in history. It didn't really matter. Gyro knew what evil the elves were capable of. He'd seen it up close and personal as he was scouting out the intern camps for their sacrifices. He had seen them using the blood of the so-called inferior races to power their demonic magic. It was enough to turn the stomachs of even the most dishonest citizen of the Dwarven kingdom. So the war was necessary, and Gyro took his part in it just as serious. He watched from his location about 30 feet above the ground in the saddle of a Y-branched tree until the elven guard pacing the wall of the fort in front of him passed out of sight. Flipping a switch that was mounted on his left bracer, he activated the miniature metal crossbow that was attached there. The crossbow arm sprang open with a click, and the dark-haired gnome took aim and fired at the wall that was slightly lower than his own position. The small barbed dart sprang across the gap, trailing the thread of cable that spooled out from the bracer. Gyro smiled in grim satisfaction as it embedded itself in the mortar between two bricks that made up the wall, right where he had been aiming. Gyro unfastened the bolt that was secured between the crossbow and his bracer. Running the short bar that had also been attached to the bracer through the eye of the bolt, he corkscrewed it into the tree. Detaching the cable from the spool, he ran it through the eye of the bolt and pulling it tight between the wall and the tree and tying it off. This was Gyro's third trip behind Elven lines, and it had been the hardest of all of them. It was usually gnomes that got assigned to the Dead List because it was easier for a gnome to conceal himself, and Gyro was the best of the best. It had taken him a month to get here, traveling by night and hiding during the day. According to all the maps he had seen, this compound wasn't supposed to exist at all. As he swung out onto the cable, the bar slipped from its place on his bracer and disappeared into the darkness below. Gyro held his breath, waiting to see if the distant clang drew the attention of any guards. A full minute passed before he managed to talk himself into continuing. Swinging his legs up, he crossed his ankles above the cable and began inchworming his way across the open space between the tree and the wall. He barely made it to the shadows as the door opened and two elven sentries emerged. So how long before the trials? They were speaking Elvish, but Gyro spoke it fluently and had no problem understanding them. The director is saying another 3 months, but the Kenendelch is pushing him. I'd guess that the trials will be moved up. 2 months? If that car arrived today was carrying Shin and Dai, I expect we'll have riders airborne by the end of the month. That soon? The Shin and Dai have a way of motivating people. Their voices faded as they passed out of hearing range. Airborne? Had they invented some kind of flying machine? That could be devastating to the kingdom. And Shin and Dai agents here? That meant Gyro would have to be extra careful not to run afoul of the Elven secret police. Just knowing that they were here almost caused him to abort the mission entirely. There hadn't been a reported case of an agent running up against one of them and coming out on top. They usually didn't even come out of it at all. Gyro swung himself up over the wall, scurried across, and looked down. The ground was lost in shadows below. Reaching under the light jacket he was wearing, he produced a small pistol wrapped in burlap. The burlap kept it from making any noise as he moved about. He checked the walkway, making sure that it was clear, and then placed the barrel of the pistol against the wall, just below the outside edge. There was a pop, about as loud as someone clapping their hands, as he triggered it. When the pistol was pulled away, it left an eye bolt embedded in the concrete. Gyro replaced the pistol under his jacket. In a few more seconds, he had attached the end of the spool of cable that was hooked to his belt and swung himself over the ledge. Pressing a button on the spool, it began to play the cable out slowly, allowing Gyro to walk down the wall. In no time at all, he had reached the bottom. Disconnecting the spool from his belt, he mentally marked the spot for his return trip. In the middle of the walled compound was his target, a huge building, almost 120 yards squared. Shrouded ventilation fans were set evenly along its wall. The one Gyro faced had a small door set in the east end. An overly alert sentry guarded it. Perhaps he had heard that Shin and Dai were on the base. He was careful to move only when the guard was looking in the opposite direction, even though the shadows seemed to cloak him. The light tended to hamper infravision, but it did not totally blind it. Once he was close enough, he realized that all but the loudest noises would be masked by the fans and the sounds coming from within. Muffled grunts and screeches that made his ear hair twitch. Whatever was in there was extremely dangerous. That made it imperative that he find out what it was, since the elves were planning on using it against the Dwarven kingdom. Apparently the elves felt that security of the outer wall and the confidentiality of the base's location was enough. He could see no other security guards than at the entrances to the building. The fan furthest away from the guard was the most logical insertion point. Moving silently, he made his way over to it. It was huge, with one blade being almost 3 gnomes tall. The shroud that covered it was just a square box with 6 louver fins mounted horizontally across it. The box itself was probably 3 feet deep. The system was set up so that the suction from the fan would keep the louver fins open. If the fan stopped, there would be no suction and the fins would fall closed. All of them were connected by a bar running vertically down the center, ensuring that they all moved as one. The opening between the bottom fins and the edge of the shroud was just wide enough for him to squeeze through. Gyro wasn't comfortable standing next to the lazily spinning fan, but he had enough room to move around. Taking a small leather bag from where it had been attached to the back of his belt, he unrolled it. Inside were several different lengths of pry bars. He selected one of the appropriate length and wedged it in so that the fins were propped in the open position. That accomplished, he turned and looked at the mechanism that was powering the vent fan. It was a simple chain and sprocket design, powered by an electric motor. Snapping open the hard leather case that was fastened to the interior of his jacket, he selected one of the 4 small vials that were secured to the padding within. A magnetic strip was attached to one side of the vial for securing it to metal. Gyro attached it to the inside edge of the chain and stepped away as far away from it as the shroud would let him. There was a pop of breaking glass as the vial was crunched between the bottom sprocket and the chain. The acid stored within ate quickly through the chain that rolled off the top of the sprocket with a muffled thud. Gyro waited almost a full minute to make sure no one had heard the noise above the other fans and the loud screeching within. No one came to investigate, so he climbed through the opening and dropped down to the catwalk just below. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting, but fear gripped him as he realized what the elf's secret weapon was. Dragons. The entire building was lined with stalls and filled with dragons. They were all young ones, and each one had a saddle strapped firmly between its shoulders. There was no doubt as to their purpose. Gyro Lash stood there with his mouth hanging open as the implications of it hit him. If they managed to tame these dragons enough for elves to ride them, that would give them the whole sky to fight from. It would severely cripple the dwarves' abilities to stop their advance. It might totally obliterate it. With the capability of flight, they wouldn't have to face their ground forces. They could just fly up and drop bombs on them. He had to report this as quickly as possible. If they were going to be airborne by the end of the month, then time was swiftly running out for Allen.